The worst part was not what Claire said. It was the way she said it, like she had finally figured out something I had been too blind to see. She sat across from me at the kitchen island with her coffee untouched, one leg crossed over the other, looking calm in a way that made the whole room feel colder. The morning light came through the blinds in sharp white stripes, cutting across the counter, the mugs, and the half-open mail on the table. While the house sat so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the wall clock above the stove. Claire looked at me for a second, then away, then back again, as if she was measuring how much of the truth I could handle. "Jason tested me," she said at last, her voice soft, almost reflective, almost proud. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt like a real woman again. I did not answer right away. I just sat there with my hands resting on the edge of the chair, feeling the weight of those words settle in the room like something dropped from a height. Jason Reed had been my best friend long enough that I had stopped thinking of him as separate from the life Claire and I built. He was there at our wedding, there at our cookouts, there when we bought the first house and painted the upstairs bedroom a pale gray, because Claire said it felt peaceful. He was the guy who knew which beer I liked, how I took my coffee, and which stories I never told twice because I hated repeating myself. For 10 years, I had trusted him like family. For 10 years, I had trusted her with the same kind of quiet certainty. That morning, both of them looked different in my mind, even before I had the full picture. Claire kept talking, not in a cruel way, but in the careful tone people use when they have already rehearsed their defense. She said she had not planned for anything to happen. She said Jason had been paying attention in a way I had not. She said he made her feel seen, noticed, wanted in the small, ordinary moments that had slowly disappeared from our marriage. Every word landed with the same strange, clean precision, like a blade that did not need to be sharp to cut. I looked at her and noticed things I should have noticed long before now. The new confidence in her posture, the extra time she had been taking with her phone, the way she had started dressing differently on weekends, as if she was preparing for a version of herself I had not been invited to see. I had told myself it was stress, then work, then just one of those seasons people go through when life gets crowded and tired. But seasons do not usually leave this kind of silence behind them. Claire reached for her mug, changed her mind, and pulled her hand back. "You are not even surprised," she said, studying my face. That was not true. I was surprised. I was just not giving her the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in real time. I had learned over the years that sometimes the loudest thing in a room is not a voice. It is the pause after someone says something they cannot take back. So I stayed quiet and let her sit in it. I let the air between us grow heavier. I let the old memories press against the new ones until I could feel the shape of the break forming. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of routines, inside jokes, late-night takeout, and shared bills. 10 years of thinking I understood the woman sitting across from me. And now, in the span of a few sentences, the story had shifted. Claire looked almost relieved to have said it out loud. But beneath that relief there was something else, something nervous and uncertain, like she had expected me to fight harder or accuse faster. Instead, I folded my hands together and asked her one simple question. "How long have you been waiting to tell me that?" The room went still again, and for the first time that morning, Claire did not answer immediately. Claire Bennett did not answer my question right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said. She sat there at the kitchen island with her shoulders still, her fingers resting against the mug she had not touched, her eyes drifting toward the window, and then back to me as though she was deciding whether to keep going or pull the whole thing back. Outside, the neighborhood was moving through its usual morning rhythm, a dog barking somewhere down the street, a lawn mower starting up 2 houses over, a delivery truck passing at the end of the block. But inside the house, everything felt paused, suspended between what had been familiar and what was now impossible to ignore. I stayed where I was, not because I was numb, but because I had already learned that if I rushed into anger, I would only give her the version of me she was expecting. Claire finally exhaled and looked down at her coffee. "I did not plan for any of this to happen," she said, still careful, still measured, like the words had been sorted and polished before she put them in the room. "It just did." I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of sentence people use when they want consequences to sound accidental. Jason Reed had been in my life long enough to know the shape of our home without asking. He knew where the spare key was hidden, which cabinet held the extra batteries, how Claire liked the eggs on Sunday mornings, and which stories I told too often because I thought they still mattered. He had stood beside me at the worst and best moments of the last 10 years, always with that easy grin, always with the kind of presence that makes a man believe loyalty is still something solid. That was what made the words harder to hear now. Not just that it was Jason. Not just that it was Claire. It was that both of them had been close enough for the damage to happen in plain sight. Claire rubbed a hand along the side of her neck and kept speaking before I could ask anything else. She said Jason had not come at her like a stranger. He had started small, with attention that sounded harmless at first. He noticed when she looked tired. He asked questions I had stopped asking years ago because life had gotten busy and I had started assuming that the quiet parts of a marriage were proof it was stable. She said he made her feel like she was still a person worth noticing, not just somebody who managed a schedule and a house and 100 little things that never seemed to count until they were missing. Her voice did not shake, but I could hear the strain in it now, the way it tightened around the truth each time she admitted something she knew would land badly. He made me feel alive again, she said, almost in a whisper, as if saying it softer would make it less cruel. I looked at her and saw not just the woman I had married, but the distance that had been building in her for a long time, quiet and slow and invisible until it became a wall. The strange part was that I did not feel exploded or frantic. I felt cold, not empty, just clear. Every late night, she had said she was tired. Every weekend, she had said she needed space. Every time Jason had called, and she had stepped away to take it. It all started lining up in a way I could not unsee now. Claire must have noticed something change in my expression because she sat up a little straighter, like she was bracing for the blow she had already brought into the room. But I did not yell. I did not throw a question at her or ask her to explain why she had let this happen. Instead, I leaned back, folded my hands on the table, and said the one thing I knew would matter more than anything else. Then we need to talk about when this started and exactly how long you have been lying to both of us. Claire Bennett finally looked up at me, and there it was again, that careful expression she wore whenever she wanted to say something painful without sounding like the villain in her own story. She sat across from me in the morning light, the same kitchen island between us, the same untouched coffee cooling in her mug, but the air felt very different now. It was not just tension anymore. It was the beginning of something I had not wanted to name until I could no longer avoid it. Claire folded her hands together, then unfolded them, then rested one palm against the counter as if she needed something solid to hold on to. It started slowly, she said. That is the only honest way I can say it. I watched her face while she said it, because I needed to know whether this was one of those speeches people rehearse in the mirror or something that had been sitting in her chest for months. It sounded rehearsed, but the emotion behind it did not. That was what made it worse. Jason Reed had not walked into our lives with some dramatic confession or some sudden moment that could be blamed on a weak night. According to Claire, it had been the opposite. Small conversations, little check-ins, the kind of attention that seems harmless until it starts feeling like oxygen. She said Jason had begun noticing what I had stopped noticing. The way she carried the weight of the house. The way she kept track of appointments, groceries, bills, and everyone else's moods while nobody seemed to ask how she was doing. She said he listened when she talked about feeling tired in a way she could not explain, tired not from work exactly, but from repeating the same days over and over until they all blurred together. I knew some of what she was talking about, or thought I did. 10 years of marriage does that. It makes you believe you know the shape of someone's frustration before they say it out loud. But there was clearly a whole part of her life I had not been reading correctly. Claire stared down at her mug while she kept talking, her voice low and careful. She said Jason made her feel seen in ways that had become unfamiliar to her. Not in a loud way. Not in some reckless, dramatic way. Just in the ordinary moments where he remembered details, asked questions, and made her feel like her words still mattered. I could hear the weight of that in her voice, and for the first time that morning I understood that this was not only about attraction or betrayal. It was also about absence. About all the invisible places in a marriage where one person starts to fade before either of them says it. She had not looked at me while saying any of this. Maybe that was because she knew what she was admitting. Maybe it was because looking at me would have made it harder to keep going. I let her talk. I did not interrupt, because every time she found another sentence, another layer, another reason, I realized there had been signs I had dismissed too quickly. The late replies. The distracted smiles. The times she seemed present in the room, but distant in some other one I could not enter. I had called it stress. I had called it life getting busy. But hearing it now, all in one stretch, it sounded less like an accident and more like a story that had been building right in front of me while I was too focused on routine to notice it changing shape. Claire finally looked up again, and there was fear in her eyes now, not because she expected me to explode, but because she could tell I was putting the pieces together faster than she wanted. I did not mean to hurt you, she said, but even she seemed to know that sentence was not enough to carry the weight of what had happened. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her for a long moment, not because I was trying to punish her with silence, but because I needed to make sure my next words came from clarity and not panic. Then tell me the truth in full, I said quietly. Not the version that makes this sound smaller. The real one. Every weekend. Every call. Every time Jason Reed became part of our life without me realizing what he was becoming to you. Claire closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them again, the truth in the room felt a little closer. Claire Bennett stayed quiet for so long that the ticking of the clock above the stove began to feel louder than either of us. The morning light had shifted a little higher now, spreading across the kitchen island and catching the rim of her mug, but she still had not touched it. I watched her breathe in slowly, then out, as if she was gathering the courage to keep going. The silence between us was not empty anymore. It was full of the things she had already admitted and the things she still had not said. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low and careful, like she was walking across thin ice and knew it. Jason did not come at me all at once, she said. That is not what happened. I did not interrupt. I only looked at her and waited, because the truth had started moving in a direction I could not ignore now, and I wanted every piece of it. She told me he had begun by asking questions no one else asked anymore. Not dramatic questions, not the kind meant to impress, just simple things. How are you really doing? Are you sleeping enough? Do you ever feel like every day is the same? She said the questions sounded ordinary at first, but that they kept coming week after week, in small places where I was usually distracted or tired or thinking about the next thing on the list. I could almost see the pattern she was describing. A call here, a message there, a conversation that began as nothing and stayed in her mind longer than it should have. Claire wrapped both hands around the mug now, though she still did not drink from it. Her shoulders stayed tense. He noticed me, she said, and the way she said it made the room feel smaller. Not in some big, theatrical way, just in ways that made me realize how invisible I had started to feel. That landed harder than I expected, not because I wanted to defend myself, but because I knew there was a thin line between hearing your spouse and truly hearing them. And apparently, I had not been walking that line as well as I thought. She said Jason remembered details. He noticed when she looked tired. He noticed when she seemed quiet at dinner. He noticed when she was carrying everything without saying how heavy it felt. I sat there listening, and the worst part was not the confession itself. It was the recognition that some of what she was saying was true enough to hurt. We had both been moving through the same life, but clearly we had not been standing in the same emotional place. She kept talking, her words growing a little more honest with each sentence, and I could feel the shape of the story changing around us. Jason had not started as some obvious threat. He had started as a presence that felt safe because it came wrapped in attention. He asked about her day. He asked about her routine. He asked about the things she felt she had stopped matching in. And I had been there, in the background, assuming that because we were together, that was enough to keep the marriage steady. It was a hard thing to hear, not because I had done nothing, but because I could see how easily distance can grow inside habits that once felt harmless. Claire looked up at me again, and this time she did not seem defensive. She seemed tired. I did not plan to betray you, she said, and I believed her just enough to know that did not make it easier. But at some point, I stopped feeling like myself, and Jason made me feel seen in a way I did not know I was missing. I let the words settle, because I knew if I spoke too fast, I would turn the whole thing into a fight instead of the reckoning it needed to be. So I stayed still and listened as the last pieces clicked into place. This had not begun with one reckless moment. It had grown from repeated attention, repeated distance, repeated silence, until both of us were standing in a marriage that looked intact from the outside and was already breaking in ways neither of us had said out loud. Claire's eyes softened a little when she saw that I was not shouting. That was almost worse for her, I think, because it meant she could not use anger as the whole story. She had to face the calm. She had to face the fact that I was hearing everything, and that hearing it did not mean I was going to collapse in the way she might have expected. I folded my hands together on the table and nodded once, not because I accepted it, but because I understood enough to know what had to come next. Then we are past excuses, I said quietly. If this is real, then I need to know exactly how far it went, and whether Jason Reed believed he was helping you, or helping himself. Claire lowered her gaze, and in that small motion I could feel the next layer of truth coming forward. Claire Bennett looked down at the table for a long time before she answered, and the waiting itself seemed to pull more truth out of her than any question I had asked. The kitchen stayed quiet around us, the refrigerator humming in the background, the morning light now warmer and lower across the counters, but neither of us seemed interested in the ordinary shape of the room anymore. We were both standing inside something much smaller now, something built from what had been left unsaid for too long. Claire finally rested one hand against the edge of the island and spoke in a voice that sounded tired more than defensive. At first, I do not think Jason meant for any of this to happen, she said. I think he thought he was helping me. I watched her carefully as she said it, because that was the kind of sentence people used when the truth had already become too large to hold cleanly. She drew in a slow breath and kept going, telling me that it had started as conversations that felt harmless, then became conversations she looked forward to, then became the only conversations in her week where she felt fully heard. She did not say it with cruelty. She said it with the uneasy honesty of someone who was starting to understand how far she had drifted before she noticed. Jason had asked about her day. He had noticed the work she did without being asked, the way she remembered every detail in the house, every appointment, every grocery list, every plan, every problem nobody else seemed to see. He made her feel important in moments I had probably taken for granted, and hearing that hurt in a way that was hard to explain because it forced me to face the gap, not just between her and Jason, but between who she had become and who I had thought I was living beside. She told me there were nights when she would sit in the car after work and talk to him for a few extra minutes because she did not want to go home yet. Not because she hated home, she insisted, but because she had started to feel like the version of herself inside our house was always the one holding things together, while the version of herself outside it still had a little room to breathe. That part landed hard. Not because it made what happened acceptable, but because it exposed how long the silence had been growing before either of us named it. Claire kept her eyes on the papers in front of her while she talked, as if looking directly at me would make the words harder to finish. She said Jason never came at her with some dramatic pitch. He did not begin by saying our marriage was broken. He began by making her feel noticed, then understood, then safe enough to say things she had stopped saying anywhere else. The dangerous part, she admitted, was that it did not feel dangerous at first. It felt like relief. It felt like somebody had walked into a room and turned the volume up on a part of her life that had gone too quiet. I sat there listening, not because I wanted every detail, but because I needed the full shape of what had happened before deciding what came next. And the more she said, the clearer it became that Jason had not simply been a friend trying to help. He had stepped into a space that was already vulnerable and made himself indispensable there. Whether he meant to or not, that was the truth of it. I could hear the strain in Claire's voice now, a tiredness that came from finally saying the thing she had probably been circling for weeks. She told me she had not meant for anything physical to happen when it started. She told me she had told herself it was only conversation, only comfort, only a place to breathe. But the line had shifted little by little, and she had let it shift because she was lonely in a way she had not known how to explain. When she said that, I looked at her long enough to understand that the marriage I thought I was defending had already been changed by 1,000 small moments I had not been present enough to catch. That was what made this so difficult. It was not just betrayal. It was the realization that somebody else had recognized the cracks before I did. Claire pressed her lips together and finally looked up. I am not telling you this to make it smaller, she said. I am telling you because I do not think I can keep pretending I do not know how it happened. Her honesty did not fix anything, but it gave the room a different kind of gravity. I nodded slowly, because now I knew the next question mattered even more than the last. Then tell me what happened after Jason stopped being just someone you talked to, I said quietly. Claire Bennett held my gaze for a moment after I asked the question, and then looked back down at the papers as if the answer was already there in front of her, waiting to be read in a way she no longer wanted to avoid. The kitchen had grown warmer as the morning moved forward, but the room still felt sealed off from the rest of the house, almost suspended in the same uneasy quiet that had settled over us from the beginning. Claire ran one finger along the edge of the table before speaking, slow and careful, like every word carried weight she had already spent too long trying to carry alone. "That is when it stopped feeling harmless," she said. "That is when I knew it was no longer just talking." I did not interrupt. I only sat there and let the silence stay open long enough for her to keep going, because I needed the whole shape of the truth, not the version she could say quickly and safely. Claire told me that after the conversation started becoming part of her routine, Jason began showing up in ways that felt impossible to ignore. He did not arrive with some grand confession or some reckless declaration. He simply became more present. A message in the middle of the afternoon. A question at the end of a long day. A kind of attention that made her feel less like she was disappearing into the machinery of the week. She said that one night, after an especially long day, she stayed in the car outside the house for almost 20 minutes because she was talking to him and did not want to end the call. That detail sat in the room like a stone. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary enough to be believable, and that made it worse. She admitted that Jason began noticing things she had stopped saying out loud. The way she looked exhausted when she came home. The way she felt like a manager of everyone else's life, but rarely like someone whose own life was being noticed. The way she had become used to making things work without anyone asking how much effort that took. Hearing her say it all made me understand why the story had unfolded the way it did. It was not just about attraction. It was about being seen in a place where invisibility had started to feel normal. Claire rubbed both hands together now, her voice low and steady but clearly strained. She said Jason never pushed her in the beginning. He made space. He listened longer than I had been listening. He remembered small things she had mentioned once and did not think anyone had heard. He made her feel like the tired parts of her still mattered. She said that after enough of those conversations, she began looking forward to hearing from him. And once that happened, the line between comfort and dependence started to disappear. I stared at her while she said that, not because I wanted to make her uncomfortable, but because I could see how many points on the map had been missed before now. The late evenings she spent on the phone, the messages that came in after dinner, the change in her mood on weekends, the way she had started dressing with a little more care whenever Jason was likely to be around. I had seen pieces of it, of course, but I had not connected them soon enough. That realization sat heavy in my chest, not because it excused anything, but because it showed me how far the distance had grown before I finally understood it was there. Claire finally looked up again, and her face had changed. The defensive edge was gone now. In its place was something more fragile, a little embarrassed, a little sad, and very tired. "I told myself it was only emotional," she said. "I told myself nothing had really happened yet. But once someone starts becoming the place you go to feel understood, it becomes harder to say where the line is." That was the part that hit deepest, because it was the kind of sentence people only say after they have already crossed a line they once thought was still far away. I leaned back slowly, letting the weight of what she said settle into the room. The story was no longer about one moment or one mistake. It had become a pattern of attention and neglect, of loneliness and timing, of one man learning the cracks in a marriage before the other did. I looked at Claire and finally asked the question that had been growing in me since she started speaking. "So, when did it stop being about conversation and start becoming something you knew would change everything?" Claire Bennett looked down for several long seconds before she answered, and in that stretch of silence I could feel the shape of the truth changing again, becoming heavier and more complicated than the simple confession she had started with. The kitchen was still bright with late morning light, but the room no longer felt ordinary. It felt narrow, almost careful, like every sound in it had become part of the conversation whether we wanted it to or not. Claire rested both hands on the table, then slowly pulled one back, then the other, as if even her posture was revealing more than she intended. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and measured, the kind of voice people use when they know there is no safe version of what comes next. "It stopped being just conversation when I started choosing it over home," she said. I did not answer immediately. I kept my eyes on her face because I wanted to understand whether she was saying that as an excuse or as an admission. It sounded like both. She took a breath and went on, telling me that after a while Jason Reed became the person she thought about when the day felt too heavy, the person she wanted to hear from when she was tired, the person who seemed to notice her mood before she had even admitted it to herself. The dangerous part, she said, was not one dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of too many small ones. A message during lunch, a call while she was still in the car, a conversation that started as comfort and slowly became the one place she went to feel understood. The more she talked, the clearer it became that she had not crossed a single line, so much as stepped over 100 tiny ones without stopping to see where they were leading. I sat there listening, and every sentence she gave me brought another piece of the story into focus. Jason had not simply been a friend who listened. He had become a quiet presence that she allowed to fill the empty spaces in her week. She told me he had once called on a Saturday afternoon when I was downstairs working on the garage shelves, and she had stood in the kitchen for nearly half an hour with the phone pressed against her ear. She said she had not meant for that call to mean anything. She said it at the time felt like relief more than betrayal. That word stayed with me. Relief. Because once someone starts calling another person relief, the marriage they are standing in has already begun to feel like pressure. Claire wiped her palm against the side of the mug without drinking from it. She looked older in that moment, not in years, but in the kind of weariness that comes from finally seeing the cost of what you have been trying not to name. She admitted that the attention made her feel alive in a way she had not felt for a long time. And that was hard to hear because it meant the distance between us had grown far enough for her to confuse being noticed with being understood. I had been present in the house, present at dinner, present in the routine, but apparently presence was not the same as connection. That thought did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, like the rest of the truth, and it landed with the kind of weight that makes a man sit very still for a moment before deciding what to do next. Claire finally looked up at me again, and there was no sharpness left in her expression now. Only fatigue, regret, and the uneasy knowledge that the story had moved beyond a simple emotional detour. "I know how it sounds," she said quietly. "I know what it became. I am not trying to pretend it was harmless anymore." I nodded once, because for the first time she was speaking in a way that did not sound rehearsed. It sounded like someone trying to tell the truth before the truth was taken away from her. And that was the moment I realized the question was no longer whether Jason Reed had stepped into our marriage. The question was how far he had gone before either of us understood what was happening. So I leaned forward a little and asked the next thing that mattered most. "Then tell me when you stopped telling yourself you could walk away from him and still keep this marriage intact." Claire Bennett did not answer immediately, and the pause between us stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator again, the soft ticking of the wall clock, and the distant sound of a car rolling past the end of the street. The kitchen still looked like the same kitchen it had been an hour ago, with the same mugs on the counter, the same pale morning light moving across the floor, but the room itself felt completely different now, as if the walls had learned the shape of the truth and could not unlearn it. Claire looked down at her hands, then at the table, then finally back at me, her expression tight with something that was not quite fear and not quite shame. It was the look of a person who had spent too long carrying a story inside her and was only now realizing how much heavier it had become. "I did not stop telling myself that," she said at last, her voice low and steady, but fragile around the edges. "I kept telling myself I could step back before it turned into anything that would destroy us." I listened without moving, because I needed to hear the whole shape of it, not the short version she could say quickly and hide behind. She drew in a slow breath and kept going, saying that there had been a point where Jason Reed felt like a place she could go when everything at home felt too still, too repetitive, too easy to move through without being seen. She said it did not start with any grand plan. It started with the small comfort of being noticed, the kind of attention that made her feel less like she was disappearing into errands, routines, and responsibilities. Then, little by little, she started looking forward to it. That was the sentence that sat hardest in the room. Looking forward to it. Because once a person starts waiting for someone else to show up in their life, the rest of the story is already changing shape whether they admit it or not. Claire continued, telling me that she had told herself the emotional part of it was harmless because nothing had happened yet that she could not still explain away. She said she thought she was only borrowing a feeling, only stepping outside for a moment, only taking a break from the weight of being the one who held everything together. But every time she said that, I could hear the lie beneath the explanation. Not because she was lying now, but because she had been lying to herself then. She rubbed one thumb along the side of her finger, a small nervous motion that revealed more than the rest of her face. I told myself I was not choosing him over you, she said quietly. I told myself I was just trying to feel like myself again. That part landed with force because I understood it too well. The desire to feel seen. The frustration of repeating the same days. The mistake of letting someone else become the only mirror that feels clear enough to trust. But understanding it did not make it smaller. It only made it more complicated. Claire finally lifted her eyes to mine, and when she did, I could see that she knew the next part would matter more than the part before it. The line, once crossed, had stopped looking like a line at all. It became a sequence of choices she had justified one at a time. The longer calls, the private messages, the time she lingered in the car because she was not ready to come home. The moments when Jason Reed became less like a friend and more like an answer she wanted to keep hearing. I sat very still while she spoke, not because I was empty, but because I was trying to understand whether there had ever been a moment where she could have turned back and chose not to. That question hung in the room while Claire's shoulders fell just a little, as if the weight of finally saying it out loud had become impossible to carry upright. I did not think I was destroying anything, she said, and now her voice carried the first real crack in it. I thought I was surviving something I did not know how to say out loud. I nodded slowly, because the story had now reached the place where survival and betrayal were beginning to look almost the same from the outside, even though they never feel the same on the inside. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm enough to surprise even me. Then tell me the part you have been avoiding, I said. The part where Jason Reed stopped being a feeling and became a decision. Claire Bennett looked at me for a long time before she answered, and in that silence I could feel the entire shape of the story shifting one last time. The kitchen had gone still again, the refrigerator humming softly in the background, the morning light now sliding higher up the cabinets and across the counter, but none of that felt ordinary anymore. It was the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel larger than it should, and the kind of quiet that tells you a marriage is standing at its final edge even before anyone says the word. Claire drew in a slow breath, then lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her as if the answer she needed was somehow written between the lines. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost worn down by the effort of saying it out loud. Jason stopped being just a feeling when I knew I was waiting for him on purpose, she said. That was the part one did not want to admit. I sat there and let that land, because I needed to hear it clearly. Not the excuses, not the careful wording, just the sentence itself. Waiting on purpose. That was the difference between drifting and deciding, between confusion and choice. She kept talking, and now there was no polished version left in her voice, only the exhausted honesty of someone who had finally run out of places to hide. She said there came a point when she stopped asking herself whether she should answer his messages and started checking her phone before she even realized she was doing it. She said the feeling of being seen had become the thing she was chasing, and the more she chased it, the more she understood she was no longer protecting what we had. That was when the weight in the room changed. Not because I had learned something explosive, but because I had learned something final. A line had been crossed not in one reckless moment, but in repeated choices, each one small enough to defend and large enough to matter. Claire wiped one hand over her face, then pressed her lips together, and when she looked back up, I saw that she knew the truth was no longer about what Jason had done to her. It was about what she had allowed herself to become while believing it could stay temporary. I did not interrupt. I let her finish. I let the last pieces settle into place, because there was no point pretending this was still a conversation about misunderstanding. Jason Reed had not simply appeared in our marriage. He had become a decision she kept making, one message, one call, one private moment at a time. And once that was said plainly, everything else felt like a long trail leading to the same unavoidable end. I stood up slowly, not because I was angry, but because I knew I had reached the part where silence was no longer enough. Claire watched me rise, her face tightening a little as she realized the conversation had moved past explanation and into consequence. I looked at her one last time and saw not a stranger, but the person I had loved through 10 years of ordinary life and quiet habits, now sitting in the middle of the wreckage of choices neither of us could undo. There was sadness in that, but there was also clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop asking why the wound exists and start accepting that it does. If you were in that kitchen, hearing a truth like that from the person you trusted most, what would you have felt first? Anger, sadness, or silence? And if this kind of slow, painful unraveling kept you watching until the very end, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this always begin quietly, and the next one may be even harder to look away from.